So what were some of the biggest challenges you encountered in your career as a manager?
Well, I guess the first one was, what does it mean to be a manager? What does this mean? What am I doing? No, but beyond that, I think one of the biggest challenges is, how do you get artists? When Charles Hamlin and I started, we had a roster of artists that just about nobody had ever heard of. And so that's your biggest challenge. And that has to do with showing up in the right place at the right time. I mentioned Jeffrey Kahane at the Van Cliburn competition. I had been tipped off that he was extraordinarily talented. What I did was go to the semifinals rather than wait until the finals, which meant that I was there before all the other managers. And by the time they came, Jeffrey and I had spoken and we had agreed to work together. So that was really good. And I'll just mention that I think often getting artists has to do with who you know and who wants to help you. Charles and I had the great privilege of managing a phenomenal singer, Arlene Auger, who died much too young. In the very beginning of her career in America, she was very well established in Germany, but nobody knew her here. And we received a tip from a friend of Charles who worked at the Brattleboro Music Festival in Vermont. And we did really, I will say, great work for her, and it was just a joy and an honor the whole time. We also had a wonderful tip from Lorraine Wales at Denison University in Ohio, who said, I have a great group for you to manage. They're a bluegrass band, and they're all one family. And we thought she had completely lost her mind, because we were a classical management, so what was she telling us about bluegrass bands? Anyway, they had appeared with the Cleveland Orchestra, and they were doing concerts with various orchestras. So we drove out to Kentucky, where they had a festival, and we signed them, and they kept us alive until the time that IMG acquired Hamlin Landau Management. So it's just seizing opportunities, but also trying at every step to have great relationships where people will want to help you. So getting artists is the first challenge. Dealing with parents can be a big challenge. I was very fortunate in the case of Leela Josefowitz and Hilary Hahn, two artists that I worked with at the beginning of their careers, that both of them had fantastic parents, and that meant that it was easy to work together and to plan without there being much friction at all. Another challenge as a manager is to, when you're working with a superstar, someone like Itzhak Perlman, who comes to you. I was very privileged to work with him, well established, well into his career. What did I know about telling Itzhak Perlman what I thought he should do in his career? So for the first few years, I was pretty terrified, I have to admit. But after a while, the key is listening. You listen to what they know, you listen to what they say, and if you have a strong feeling that you think could be beneficial, then you have to be courageous enough to venture an opinion at the right moments. But I think listening is something one has to learn as a manager. And the last thing I would say is, a manager has a unique problem because they have two sets of clients. The artist is a client, and the presenter that you're trying to sell the artist to is a client. And they both don't always have the same interests. So a presenter will say to you, Edna, if you don't get this artist for me, I don't know what I'm going to do. And the artist will say, I refuse to add one more date to my calendar. I am already overbooked. So navigating that and remembering that ultimately at the end of the day, the artist is your client. And if they put their foot down and say no, then you have to go back to the presenter and say, look, you know I've always tried to help you every single time. This time, I'm afraid I can't give you the answer you want. Hopefully next time.
Wow. Amazing stories. I also wanted to ask you about crossover and the new opportunities that classical musicians have that are less traditional and less within the framework of what is usually defined as classical music. Do you see that as a plus or a minus when it comes to the career potential?
You know, I think it is a plus, but it's not for everybody. So if it happens that artists are talented and gifted and interested in performing in different genres, it creates a more complete profile of who they are, and the public can get to see different sides of them that sometimes help to create career awareness for them. It may be that let's just say this whole tendency to go into clubs and untraditional venues and one by one win over people in a more casual atmosphere with perhaps a program that's accompanied by the spoken word and introductions and making things more accessible. I think that all of that is great. That may be classical repertoire, but at least it's in a more casual venue, and I think it's accomplished a lot. I think if you put a program either there or somewhere else that has a jazz piece on it, or something else entirely that's out of the box, it makes you more interesting. It makes it more likely that you'll be reviewed. If we have a few reviewers left, I think we have a few. It makes it more likely that you'll receive coverage in one form or another by doing that sort of thing. The danger is that sometimes when people cross over, they're not really sure anymore who they are. And it's very hard to... Some people will say, oh, I don't want that person because they're not classical, they're jazz. And somebody else will say just the opposite. And you end up in a hole in the middle where people don't really know who you are. So I think it's important to have a certain center in your own mind and to then venture out from there, but keep the core solid so that people know who you really are.
Now, you actually live on the East Coast in New York, even though you work full-time at the Colburn School in Los Angeles. Having sort of a foot on each coast, what would you say about how the artistic scenes are different and what the paths are for artists depending on where they choose to live?
You know, that's a bit of a tough question for me because I have only really worked on the West Coast now for a little over 2 years. And even then, I've only lived and worked in part-time in Southern California. I work full-time and live part-time in Southern California. So I don't feel as though I'm an expert about the West Coast. But I'll say this, quality is comparable whether you're out here or you're in the East, on the East Coast. I think that sometimes people do best in smaller schools away from the hustle and bustle. So there could be something to be said for some people that if you're at the Colburn Conservatory with about 120 students, you get to know everybody so much better, they get to know you better, there are maybe more opportunities to perform, and it could be more, more beneficial to you to be in a school like that. And of course you have Curtis on the East Coast, which is very similar. But I think the difference is one not of quality but of volume. If you're on the East Coast and you're in New York or close to New York, you have so many opportunities to hear enormous amounts of concerts, meet people, audition for people, network with people, and it's a little bit harder when you're out here. There are great artists that come this way, there's no question about it, but in terms of volume, it's not as many. So some people will do best to stay on the West Coast and use everything that's out here that's great. There are some fabulous training programs here. You know, you have Music Academy of the West, Music at Menlo, for example, comparable to anything that's available on the East Coast. It's a very personal choice. But in terms of volume, I think there's no question that there's probably much more. It's easier to find collaborating musicians to maybe embark on adventurous chamber music projects if you're based on the East Coast.
Now you have a very new and very exciting project with the publication Musical America where you'll be doing a weekly advice column for students. How did this idea come about and how do you feel about it?
Well, I'm very excited about it, and remember in the beginning I told you everything sort of happens by accident or seems that way. This started from 2 summers ago. In the summer of 2009, I was having lunch with Sedgwick Clark, who's the editor of the annual directory of Musical America. And I said to him, your articles feature your musicians of the year, instrumentalist of the year, vocalist of the year, and so on. But I don't see a lot of young blood there. Sometimes they're young artists, but they're very far along already. And who's covering the young people who are struggling out there to get this kind of recognition, the heroes who are doing fascinating things in the very beginning stages of their career? And he said, frankly, nobody. And I said, well, I'd like to write an article about that. So it was too late to do it in 2009, and he approached me again in 2010, and that's how the article that I've just written, called Getting Noticed in the 21st Century, was written and will appear in the directory and also online. But I did take that one step further when I met Stephanie Challoner, who's the publisher of Musical America, and who, unbeknownst to me, is passionate about helping young artists. And I said, Stephanie, I've been thinking of doing a career column to help young artists, not just students, but artists already in their careers, navigate their way. I want everyone to have a place that they can go and ask a question, because they may not be in school anymore, they may not know who to ask. And I'm just wondering, is that something, I don't even know if I asked her if she'd be interested. I think she jumped in and said, oh yeah, Musical America, that's where it belongs. So she came up with, I believe, the title Ask Edna. And we are launching the column on January 14th. Anybody who wants to ask a question can write into, the address is askedna@musicalamerica.com. And I'll be doing the column weekly on Thursdays, I believe, and answering several questions at a time.
How wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, you've accomplished so much in your career, and I'm sure there's still so much more to come. What are your dreams looking into the future of things that you would still like to do?
Well, I think that when I think about the future, I just think about what I'm doing now on a bigger scale. I guess my goal is to reach more students. I do a fair amount of lecturing. I visit different campuses and interact with students. Sometimes I hear them, sometimes I speak with them. I always speak with them and meet with them, sometimes one-on-one. I would just like to reach as large a group of young people who need career help as I can. And the great thing about Musical America and the new column is that it will be reaching people internationally, it will be publicized internationally, and I hope that someday I can be instrumental in putting some sort of resource organization together that will have a group of experts who can be called upon for any type of question, and we will be able to address these sorts of questions from all over the world. That would make me so happy that artists would never have to feel helpless and would always have some place to turn.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. You've done so many things that have helped really the world in terms of artists getting exposure. So thank you so much, and we look forward to following your column on Musical America.
Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I want to commend you for the work that you've done on iCadenza, which I think it's very hard to launch any kind of a new venture in these days, and in the relatively short time that you've been doing this, you've made a real mark, and it's a very important contribution for all of the young artists out there, so thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.